Take. Hi. Thanks very much, Danielle, for asking me to come on and speak to you all. I'm assuming that most of you are patients or people that do not have spleens. So if you could raise your hand, those that don't have a spleen. So a third. So maybe you're with a relative or you're with someone else. So Spleen Australia was set up in 2003, just in Victoria, in 2 hospitals, and it gathered momentum because it was seen to be doing such a great job. It's called Spleen Australia, but we haven't got all the states on board because we can call it Spleen Australia because anybody can access our website and get our information. So even you folks in the States are very welcome to have a look at what we do. This was just my little plug for the group today to say good on you, and I think your website's doing really well, and I think you've got a dynamo here to my right who's really working hard to push this ahead and help improve your care and what's been happening to you. So I'm just going to, I don't want to frighten you, but I just want to say why doctors get so anxious about you having a splenectomy is because of this problem with overwhelming post-splenectomy sepsis. So it's very rare. And this was a patient that I just thought I'd talk to you about who had ITP, and he was in his 60s. So he'd had a splenectomy for ITP in 2009. He had some other medical conditions, and he was found at home in October 2015, and so 6 years after his splenectomy. Now that's not a very long time. There's some really nice case studies that your risk of infection if you've had a splenectomy goes out for the rest of your life. So 50, 60 years post-splenectomy, you can still have some terrible infections. So he was feeling very well. He had a high temperature and he was found unconscious by a relative. And he was transferred from a regional hospital to a Melbourne hospital, had a cardiac arrest, was terribly unwell, survived, and he's done well. And his only history was that he'd had one pneumococcal vaccine in the past. So he wasn't up to date with other vaccines, but this, and I don't know what serotype or strain of strep pneumoniae he had, but this is the most common bacteria that people without spleens have problems with. So what happens with your spleen? Your spleen sits at the tail end of your pancreas, and a lot of blood goes through it. And inside the spleen sit the macrophages and some really important white blood cells. And their role is to trigger an antibody response and basically get rid of the bacteria. And they're the encapsulated bacteria, so the ones with a coat. And we think of those ones as pneumococcal, meningococcal, and Haemophilus influenzae. So that's what we have to educate patients about. Now, so it's a reservoir that holds these white blood cells. It also has an important role filtering out red blood cells, but that's another story because really I'm just going to talk about your risk of infection. So if you have your spleen out, your bone marrow still makes these white blood cells, so you don't have to worry too much, but they're just not sitting in a nice place to act quickly when you have bacteria going around in your blood. So he did well, and this, as I said, this was the strep pneumoniae that caused his illness. So we all talk about why you can lose a spleen, and this is a general talk about splenectomy. So trauma is very common, infections, malaria when you get an enlarged spleen, and then we've had a bigger group with people that have had pancreatic cancers. So the spleen sits at the end of the pancreas, and they often take it out because it gets in the way, and so they give prophylactic vaccines because they don't want it to be nicked or damaged when they're doing the surgery because it holds a lot of blood. So there's also another group of patients, just for your information, that don't have a functioning spleen. So the spleen has not working properly due to autoimmune type illnesses. So we've got some little babies on our database that were born with funny heart abnormalities, celiac disease, sickle cell anemias. They're sort of in that group where people have thalassemia, and those people are born with that illness. This was a little boy who had severe meningococcal W, and he ended up having a big splenic abscess, and his spleen then just packed it in. But he had a terrible meningococcal W, and he ended up with no feet. But he did survive, and he's an absolute button. But he's got to live a life with no feet. So I don't want to ski too much, but you need to know what the risks of infections are. So we talk about a lifetime risk. Now that is in a background of not having a registry, of people running around trying to find out what to do, what's the best advice, who's doing what. It's all over the shop. And so it looks a bit scary because it says 1 in 20. It's a lifetime risk of 1 in 20 can get sepsis, so a bad infection. And then it carries quite a high mortality, and that's because people ignore the symptoms of an ensuing bacterial infection. The risk is considered high in the first 2 years while your body's adjusting not to having the spleen, and it's getting used to not having that filtering process and the breaking down of bacteria. But as I said before, some of these terrible infections can occur 30 to 60 years later. And we register patients that have had a splenectomy and they say, oh, I don't know what you're banging on about. You know, I haven't had a spleen for 60 years and I'm fine. But we do have a couple of patients that have ended up in a bad way because they've been ill-informed. And then, as I said, strep pneumoniae is the most common bacteria. So we'd like to also address the cost of one of these horrible infections. So if you do end up in intensive care, very rare. We think it's common because we see a couple a year, but some people, general physicians probably might only see one in their lifetime as being a doctor when they've gone through ED or somewhere like that, or intensive care. So it can cost up to $280,000 just your treatment, especially if you've been very unwell. And we use an OPSI definition as you've had to go to intensive care. So OPSI still occurs. It still occurs around the world, even though there's some nice guidelines about how to prevent these infections. And often the problem is the medical staff don't know where to go. They don't know what the risk is. They don't know the strategies to give patients. And there's a whole heap of things that we can do and tell patients to avoid some of these infections. The advice is forgotten. We're all busy. Young people in car accidents who lose their spleen, they just go on and live a life and forget that they recover from their injury and do well, and they forget it. The quality of advice varies and no reminders. So that's an important thing because when people need more than ever to be jogged, have their memory jogged, that you need to do something. So in 2003, we set up the registry. And this is our database. So it was built to manage, infinitesimal numbers, but we always say 25,000, because that's what we estimate there are people with hyposplenism or splenectomy. So about 5% of people on our database have hyposplenism, and so they're the ones that it doesn't work. So this is a very interactive website. It's got all our newsletters on it, and lots of other bits and bobs. So just in a nutshell, there are just under 10,000 patients on our database, and the main thing is education, coordinating education and giving people the latest information. Then we do some research and some other interesting things. So where are we in regard to what's happening in Australia? So we have covered in Tasmania, Victoria and Queensland. And WA have just asked for a quote. New South Wales is itching to join us, but their health department's not been forthcoming in funding us. New Zealand loves us and they've copied our database, and it's identical. So we're just covering roughly under half the population of Australia. So referrals. So in this day, in 2003, we could sit back and have cigarettes and cocktails at work, but now we go completely bonkers and we're recruiting about 1,000 patients per year, 1,100. And it got busy once Queensland and Tasmania joined us. So what do we do? So I say to patients, if you forget everything that I say, I just want you to remember the signs and symptoms of a bacterial infection, because all the antibiotics in the world, all the vaccines in the world will not protect you 100%. But if you will act readily when you start feeling unwell, this could be life-saving. So obvious things like you're feeling really terrible, vomiting, diarrhoea, shivers, shakes, high temperatures, unable to get warm. People say, I ran the bath and jumped into it and I was still shivering and shaking. And they didn't really understand. They didn't know that that was a really important sign to go and get checked out. So feeling really dreadful. The other thing, part of the education, is all the patients carry an alert card. Have you got yours on you?
It's my wallet.
You've got yours on your phone?
Yep.
See, look, I tell you what, I'm doing well today. It's fabulous. So the vaccinations, they're complicated and they've changed a lot, and they're always changing. So in the old days, it used to be, probably when you two started out, it used to be just a Pneumovax 23 and every 5 years. Well, now there are 2 different types of pneumococcal vaccines and we give them at different times. And it's only 3 Pneumovax 23 in a lifetime. The meningococcal, now we're protecting people because these are the encapsulated bacteria with meningococcal ACWY and meningococcal B, and then Haemophilus influenza. That's just one vaccine if you didn't get it in childhood. And annual flus, because we don't want you to get the flu, because if you get the flu, then you're more prone to get a secondary bacterial infection. Antibiotics, that's a hot topic at the moment. So I don't think many, certainly the trauma surgeons in America don't give them because they say 10% of patients take them. But when they're registered, if it is a recommendation, which it is in the Australian therapeutic guidelines, if it says that they should be on something, because we follow the guidelines, we will tell patients this is what's in the Australian guidelines. And we've shown that 85% of people will take an antibiotic if they are registered because somebody sat them down and explained the story behind the antibiotics. There is also a worse story behind it, is that in adults there's never been a randomised controlled trial in people without spleens on antibiotics, whether they do better on antibiotics. So in children with sickle cell anaemia in 1988, there was a physician who did a randomised trial in kids with sickle cell anaemia, and they found overwhelmingly that they needed to be on an antibiotic. So that's children. So we haven't been able to do that in adults, and so it's still a bit of expert opinion. So we were talking about phase 3 studies. There's been no study to really iron out this definitively. But and what the story is behind having a very low dose of antibiotics in your bloodstream is that should you be exposed to one of these infections, that might be just enough to fend it off. And then the other thing about carrying an emergency supply of antibiotics is that if you are very unwell, you can start your own treatment before you get to hospital. So there's a rule of thumb, like with strokes, that if you can get to treatment within 4 hours after your stroke, you do much better. It's the same with a septic episode. If you can get to hospital within that 4 hours of being absolutely dreadful, like being unconscious or rigors or being terribly unwell, your prognosis will be much better. So this is how you register online, just a quick picture. So all the doctors, anybody we can think of gets a copy of our report. So we go to the nth degree to find out what vaccines you've had. We also, out of the kindness of our own hearts, now put them up onto the adult immunisation register. I don't know if you've got. So what we have in Australia is it's called the National Immunisation Program, and all kids that get vaccinated, for years and years, that was on its own database. And in their great wisdom, they've extended it now for adults, but it's only from its forward planning. So we go back and fill in these dates. So patients can, I don't know your name, sorry. Jeanette. It's like Jeanette. She's downloaded her form from the department's website and she can look and see all the vaccines she's had. And so we go to our, when we've got a spare minute and add these past history of vaccines. So that's the plan. We tell people if they're allergic to things, and that goes to as many people as possible. Also advertising the service. So what do you get? You get a kit, and this is the alert card. You can get a DVD, but now we've put those patient stories up on the website. There's a fridge magnet to remind you that if you move, please let us know, because we always want to be in touch with you. Also, it reminds you, if you're going travelling, please be aware of that malaria risk, especially if you're going to Africa or off the beaten track in Thailand. There is a malaria risk. To please speak to your GP 4 to 6 weeks before you plan to go travelling. And then there's a card that we write down the vaccines that you've had. For kids, they like a plastic alert band. We've got some of those. We've also done a special information sheet for kids. And then here are recommendations. So we've recently updated them. They're available on our website. So it's a bit complicated, but it's just to show you what it looks like. So in our Australian immunisation handbook, it's broken up into diseases, so pneumococcal, meningococcal, Haemophilus, and all sorts of different. So we've put them all together just for splenectomy patients or people with hyposplenism, because it's very hard to read and go through it. So this is if patients have had something in the past. So that's if you're a vaccine naive patient, you know what to give them. And this is if you've had something in the past, how to do the catch-up. Then on this page, it's all about antibiotics, vaccines, when to give them, the differences, how to give them if you've had chemo or radiotherapy, the key points about education, blood tests to test and confirm hyposplenism, travel alerts, and children. They're just links. Then we've got some experts in Queensland, Victoria and Tasmania put this together. So these are our paediatric guidelines. As I said before, some of the vaccines aren't covered. So if you happen to be unfortunate enough and be in a hospital, a public hospital, and you just want to check if you're up to date, if they give us a quick call, we can organise your vaccines for you as an inpatient, and they're free. So some of these vaccines, so this one isn't on the PBS, but we have little ways of getting it. This one is, so that's why it's on reduced. But these ones are expensive. So it's $600 for your first and second round of vaccines. So how do we remind patients? We've just put up the 2019 newsletter. That gets sent to all the patients, but we're thinking it's too expensive and we'll email them to them now. We have a lot of non-English speaking patients. So we've got a cartoonist that's really helped us with some pictures. We also are in the 21st century and we have an iPhone app. So that keeps all the vaccine dates on your phone. It's got lots of tidbits about travel and signs of infection, and it's basically a very good portable record of vaccines. So if you have a vaccine at your GP's clinic and you put it on the app, that will synchronise with our database and it pops up. So just who's on the database, I just thought I'd quickly show you this. 90% of people have had a splenectomy, 5% have had hyposplenism, and then also there's a group of patients that when they had a trauma to their spleen, they've got this new procedure where they block the splenic artery and it slows down the flow. You're doing that in trauma? So that's been very successful. And then that number's gone through the roof. So I just thought for today's talk, I'd just break down who's had a splenectomy. So trauma is pretty much the highest group. And then your haematological disorders, heme malignancies, cancers, so they're bowel cancers or pancreatic cancers. Incidental, so somebody's had an operation and they've nicked the spleen and had to have it removed then and there. And lots of other things like infections. So I looked out of my group of 2016 in the haematological disorder, how many of those had ITP as a reason for splenectomy? So there's 1,000 on our database out of the 2,000. So, and just some pictures of a person with some petechiae. So what about the spleen registry? So what have we been shown that we're effective? So we've been going for 16 years, and to get ongoing funding, we've needed to show that we're doing a good job. Not only have we found that we are cost effective, we've also found that if you are registered with us, you have a 69% reduction in sepsis. So that's been a big, really fantastic result, and it prevents these horrible infections in the state. So we probably get, for people without spleens, we probably see about 7 to 8. So we're really decreasing the number of terrible infections. Patients love us. The GPs ring us all around Australia. Haven't had. I've had a couple of American patients email me. So this is my team. This is here. Dennis Spellman was the main one. He's the infectious diseases physician that's the lead of our program. The pharmacists are amazing. They will go through everything with a fine-tooth comb. They will also hold back vaccines so that the wrong ones aren't given. We spend a lot of time correcting things. The problem is sometimes people get their vaccines in the wrong order, or they get them the day of their splenectomy or the day after, and we have to sort that out because that's not really the best way to give vaccines. Okay, so we're just going to do a little quick fun thing for you all.
Well, hey there, folks, I am a spleen. I'm purple and I'm bigger than a jelly bean. I live inside your body on the left side. Just under your ribs is where I reside. I'm not here to cause hysteria. My main function's to fight bacteria. I filter red blood cells and then I recycle them. I store white blood cells to fight infections. As an organ, I'm important to keep you healthy, but sometimes people are born without me. Sometimes I'm infected, sometimes I burst, and sometimes I simply do not work. But a happy, healthy life can still be yours, and here's Dr. Steve to tell you more.
The Spleen Australia team will tell you what it means when you don't have a
I'm
spleen.
Dr. Steve, and I'm here to say that life without a spleen can be a-okay. There's a few things I want to explain to ya about managing your asplenia. And none of this should make you feel terrified. Just take your antibiotics as prescribed and have a backup supply just in case, and make sure your vaccinations are up to date. Because your immune system's compromised, your ability to fight infection is minimised. If you feel unwell, got a fever or the shakes, go see your doctor for goodness sakes.
If you don't have a spleen and you don't know what that means, the Spleen Australia team will give you a routine when you don't have a spleen.
Thanks, Dr. Steve. Hi, I'm Sue, and I've got some helpful information for you. I can tell you all about infections and disease and your susceptibility to all of these, like meningitis, influenza, pneumonia. Overseas, there's a risk of malaria. If you get a bite or scratch from an animal, then seeing a doctor would be advisable. But life doesn't have to be all that hard, as long as you carry your medical alert card.
If you don't have a spleen and you don't know what that means,
Or a non-functioning spleen, don't forget about them.
the Spleen Australia team will give you a routine.
Put your medical alert card in the air.
You don't have a spleen and you don't know what that means.
This video's the sickest thing I've seen all day.
The Spleen Australia team will give you a routine when you don't have a spleen.
Woo!